If you're watching this video, then I'm not going to be making any more of these kinds of videos, at least on this channel. I'm going to be talking through House of the Dragon episode by episode over on my second channel, To the Future, linked down below. Talking through the themes, the narrative, the differences to the book, just a bit more casually, so it doesn't really fit on the Hello Future Me channel. I'm going to be releasing it a day after the episode every single week as it's airing. So, House of the Dragon is back, and it is different in multiple ways. The first of which you probably already noticed in the opening credits. Honestly, I think this is them listening to and responding to criticism, because in the first season, we had this opening where there was blood flowing down this stone altar of sorts, and the blood represented the different houses of Westeros. But if you didn't read Fire and Blood or know the history of Westeros, it probably wouldn't make much sense just looking at it. So the new opening is this progressively woven tapestry, kind of like the Bayeux Tapestry depicts the conquest of England by William the Conqueror. There's this really great line in the first season from Helena where she says, "Hand turns loom, spool of green, spool of black, dragons of flesh, weaving dragons of thread." Now, Helena seems to be a bit of a dreamer, has the gift of prophecy. It's really fantastically building on her character in the books, actually. One of those additions which really work, but the line, dragons of flesh weaving dragons of thread, that can be interpreted in multiple ways. I like to think of it kind of like the tapestry. This is a story that will go down in the annals of history, like the greatest historical tales are often woven in these vast tapestries, not unlike the one we see here in the opening credits. It is a dragon of thread. And so this new tapestry, it depicts the story of the Targaryens with the doom of Valyria, Aegon flying with his sisters, the lords of Westeros bending the knee, the fields of fire, the peaceful reign of Jaehaerys, and finally now our two monarchs vying for the throne, Aegon and Rhaenyra. I much prefer this opening. I think it's way better. I still think it suffers from some of the kind of clarity problems. It moves quite fast, and unless you know the history, I don't know if you're always going to know what you're looking at, but it is better. You will recognize some of what you see, and partly because it's so bright and colorful, and one of the major criticisms of season 1 was that it was way too dark all the time, including the opening. I would love to see more events from the story be woven into the tapestry, kind of like we have Aegon and Rhaenyra now sitting on their two thrones. I still think a Targaryen-esque Game of Thrones theme with the map panning to the locations relevant to this story would be better. Like, do people know where Old Town is, or Harrenhal is in relation to King's Landing? I don't know, but I'm curious about what you think. Do you like this intro more? Let me know down below. This season, the battle lines have been drawn, with the greens on one side around King Aegon and the blacks on the other around Queen Rhaenyra, and now we see all the other houses, like the Starks and Tullys, picking sides. The tagline for the season is, after all must choose. This episode is fundamentally about grief and revenge. Otto warns Aemond to not let his desire for action or vengeance take a hold of him. Rhaenyra is lost in her grief, unable to act after the death of her son Lucerys, who you might remember was hungry hippoed at the end of last season, while Daemon orders a brutal retribution in blood and cheese, an act which would go on to break Helena, and you can really see her dissociate in the scene. George once described his books as being about the human heart in conflict with itself, and that's on full display in this episode. Grief can be a mobilizing force, but often in ways which are uncontrollable and irrational, and the Dance of Dragons itself arises from a series of uncontrolled emotions. Indifference and sentimentality in Viserys, or resentment in Alicent, lust in Daemon, anger in Criston Cole, and now grief in Rhaenyra. But grief can also be a paralyzing force, and we see that in Rhaenyra too. But there is an underlying tension to this episode and to the story as a whole between caution and action. We have characters like Daemon and Aemond who symbolically reflect each other, both yearning to take action and further the cause and take charge of the fight, but often doing so in ways which, well, make it all worse. On the other hand, we have characters like Otto and Rhaenys who wish to get all their pieces into position before making a move, and that might seem wiser on the face of it, but the dance was also set in motion by Viserys' own inaction in the first place, and all in the name of caution. We can see the conflict maturing, not only between the Greens and the Blacks, but within the factions themselves, in arguably more important ways. King Aegon wants to take action as king, to be in that role in whatever way he can, but Otto has to repeatedly hold him back, which is actually really in line with the book in a really interesting way. I think they build on the characters there quite well. Listen to this. Sir Otto was losing the trust of his king, who mistook his efforts for inaction and his caution for cowardice. Aegon entered the Tower of the Hand and found Sir Otto writing another letter, whereupon he knocked the inkpot from his grandsire's lap, declaring, "Thrones are won with swords, not quills. Spill blood, not ink." Now, I'm betting that moment, that line, will actually show up in the show still. I reckon it'll probably be next episode, but it quite well exemplifies the conflict which is brewing here, especially because it goes deeper than that. If Aemond and Vhagar are the most potent weapon on the continent, as Otto says, then will their emotions get in the way of their duty, like it has before? Will Rhaenyra's emotional paralysis prevent her from acting in the way she needs to, like it did with Viserys, or will it cause her to act rashly? And that question left me thinking about a line Otto has this episode: "When the king speaks, all hear it." This line is said to Aegon as a warning: be careful what you promise, be careful what you say, be careful what you ask for, because you don't know what people will take from it. But I think it's actually more interesting when we apply it to one of Rhaenyra's only lines in this episode. She says, "I want Aemond." And though she never said it explicitly, she arguably sets in motion the horrific murder of a child at the end of the episode, purely by raising her voice as queen. And this is interesting because in the book, history attributes more malice to her in saying that she swore an oath of vengeance against Aemond and Lord Boros. It implies she approves, and one way we can interpret this is the queen spoke and history heard it. A leader must always be precise and controlled with their speech. But the biggest change in the episode comes right at the end, with Blood and Cheese. Blood and Cheese in the episode set out to find Aemond and get revenge on Daemon's order, but they seem to get lost and can't find him, so instead they just chance across Helaena and her children. They then force her to tell them which one is the boy and butcher him in his bed. In the book, which I wish I had here with me, Blood and Cheese plays out way more horrifically. First, they go and find Alicent and bind and gag her. They strangle her bedmaid right there and then in front of her. They then wait in ambush until Helaena and her children come along, and then they kill the guards and they tell Helaena what they're gonna do. She begs for them to kill her instead of her kids, and they say no. And instead, they force her to pick between her two sons which one should live. In the book, she has another son, but Helaena is forced to pick between her children, and I'm just gonna read you the quote. "On her knees, weeping, Helaena named her youngest, Maelor. Perhaps she thought the boy was too young to understand, or perhaps it was because the older boy, Jaehaerys, was King Aegon's firstborn son and heir, next in line to the Iron Throne. You hear that, little boy?" Cheese whispered to Maelor. "Your mama wants you dead." Then he gave Blood a grin, and the hulking swordsman slew Prince Jaehaerys, striking off the boy's head with a single blow. The queen began to scream. They kill the one she wanted to save in front of her. It's different to the books, but it's different in a way we have seen before. It's important to remember Fire and Blood is written like an historic text. It's got contradicting narratives, details are exaggerated or speculated on, or just completely made up in some cases. The problem isn't that it's different to the book. There's lots of that in House of the Dragon, and most of it's actually really good. The problem is here which changes and why, because it's weird to see which details they did stick with. Like Cheese says he knows the Red Keep better than the shape of his cock, which is an almost direct quote from the book, and Blood looks exactly like he does in the show. Or how we get this line about how a wife's not a son, but in the show, Blood and Cheese are much less in control of what's happening. They kind of stumble across Helena's room by accident, they get lost in the tunnels, they luckily avoid every guard where in the books they have to kill them to get to them, and the core issue seems to be that they can't tell which kid is a boy and which is a girl, and so instead of forcing Helaena into this horrific dilemma where she has to choose between her children, she's just pointing out which one is a boy under threat. And in the books, Blood and Cheese make the active decision to kill Helena's kid when they can't get to the real target. It's more calculated. It's still horrific, but it doesn't have the same bite because characters don't have as much agency. And this is something we've seen before in House of the Dragon, characters having their agency removed or minimized in favor of misunderstandings and confusion. Sometimes this can work, like Aemond not intending to kill Lucerys but Vhagar doing it anyway. I initially wasn't a fan of, but on reflection, it's actually really interesting. But sometimes it doesn't work, kinda like here. The biggest one being when Alicent thought Viserys was telling Aegon was the chosen heir on the deathbed, where in the books, it's a deliberate decision. At least with Alicent in the show, it's clear the writers are trying to maintain her as a well-intentioned character, not just like hungry for power. She's got a legitimate reason for believing that. But with Blood and Cheese, like, they're already irredeemable murder hobos. This change just removes some of the depth of the story beat by taking away the dilemma that was originally there. It's not that it's unbelievable, it's just less interesting than it could have been. I'm not sure what was gained, what they were going for by having Helaena and Blood and Cheese have less agency in the scene than they do in the books, but I'm very curious about what you guys think of this scene. How did you feel watching it? What is fascinating to see is how much they're really leaning into the tragedy of the Dance of Dragons in Season 2. So much of a tragedy is a chain of events playing out in the worst way possible, often forcing people into terrible positions, which while they may not have total control over, are deeply rooted in their character flaws. You know, Aemon's pride and belief in his own ability and mastery of controlling Vhagar is one of those. He thought he was more in control than he was, and there were tragic consequences for that. Or there's Otto's insatiable desire for power, but also his surety in his own position, leading him to make more and more dangerous gambles on the political stage, like showing his power over the king in public around the small folk, or Rhaenyra's blind rage. There's this Targaryen way of doing things, fire and blood, which for a long time is kind of portrayed as this glorious thing, you know, the raw power of the dragons, deep and old magic, but it's being shown for what it is when they're all pitted against each other. Because the horror of a tragedy is how everything can feel simultaneously totally avoidable and utterly inevitable at the same time. Every choice along the way understandable, but every consequence being dragged out from the last choice and deepening the flaws that made it all start in the first place, and making it harder to resist those choices in the future. Especially because the flaws of our characters are only magnified by their dragons. We've already seen this with Aemond and Rhaenys, and we can only wonder how much farther and deeper and bloodier it will go. So far, House of the Dragon has really succeeded in setting that feeling up, and it's only in that tragic feeling that House of the Dragon will feel so different to Game of Thrones. Let me know your thoughts on the episode down below. Follow over on the second channel if you haven't already, and stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.